Hey everyone. I have a few interviews that I'm going to be releasing in the next week or so, but this is another solo essay that I've worked up to see if I can help transition the issue of Israel-Palestine that I've been so focused on and kind of broaden it out to a place of maybe a larger global or geopolitical and historical context. Because I don't know about you, but this last year has been, I think, about something much bigger than just Palestine. And so I have three conversations scheduled to do this kind of thing. One is with Juan Cole. Juan is a historian and curator of the long-running blog Informed Comment. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of geopolitics and argues that so many conflicts, which are cast as ideological clashes about democracy or values or religion or anything else, are much more accurately explained as wars over resources and things like water and food and oil and shipping lanes. He's long been a critic of U.S. foreign policy on many of these issues and does a really excellent job of placing Israel into that picture as a kind of very ugly asset for the interests of the U.S.-led global alignment. I'm also speaking with Irene Genzier, who has written specifically about the United States' oil policy in the Middle East and how Israel became a key player in that game. She and I will get deep into the legacy of Henry Kissinger and what came to be known as shuttle diplomacy, which really is still the main method of engagement for a superpower like the United States. And of course, how all of these dynamics sort of steamrolled the dignity, concerns, and of course lives of the Palestinians. And perhaps in a way which greatly underestimated their resolve and determination not to be pushed aside. And then finally, I'm speaking with Vijay Prashad, and I think I'm going to release that conversation first. Vijay is an author, a journalist, and an activist who's been writing and researching tirelessly for years now on general anti-neocolonialist activities. And I think is really one of the best voices out there who understands how to connect the right dots from the sometimes very confusing and messy headlines and news events. And in particular, he and I are going to discuss the general changing attitude of what he defines as the global South and trace a lot of our conversation back to the post-World War II decades where the formal colonialism structure was crumbling and the world seemed to have been on fire with liberation movements, ethno-national movements, Marxist movements, feminist movements, independence movements, and above all else, this Cold War justification for neoconservative operations to ensure that many of those ideas and people would not survive for long. I've become really interested in that era. And all of this is because I'm really interested in trying to usher the energy and focus that I think many of us are seeing on the particular issue of Palestine into something more sustainable and global and maybe more meaningful and focused in a way. Because I think for anyone who has become energized by the tragedy and horror of Palestine, it doesn't take long in the research to see a kind of larger web of forces and factors at play, which are all contributing to what many of us feel is a morally unacceptable status quo. And of course, I'm speaking about the post-October 7th world and the pre-October 7th one, which was not any kind of just or sustainable situation in Palestine and beyond. Okay, so in this essay, I hope to accomplish a couple things. I want to address the whole woke versus anti-woke stuff by laying out what I feel is a really important philosophical idea regarding what's called unjust riches, and coupling that with philosophical arguments around free will. I've been eager to lay this all out in an essay, and I've been working to refine my presentation of it after having it misunderstood a few times while I was a guest on other shows. So I really think it can help clarify so many conversations, so I'm going to do that. But I'm also going to start by telling a relevant personal story of my first ever trip out into the world to get into these more intricate philosophical topics. Okay, so here we go. So in the previous video essay that I shared with you, I told a story about my upbringing, which included a long list of activities within the Jewish community, from Hebrew school to youth groups to my bar mitzvah. And I mentioned that it all sort of culminated in a planned summer trip to Israel after my junior year of high school. I think those kinds of trips and pilgrimages really are fairly common for American Jews. They certainly were in my community. But that was where I finally kind of put my foot down. I'd been arguing and fighting with my parents on the issue of Israel and Zionism for a few years at that point. I was feeling a lot of just general angst and annoyance about the whole path that had seemingly been laid out for me. I was watching many of my friends discuss the programs and trips they were about to go on. Many of them had older brothers or sisters who had gone on them a few years prior. My brother had done that as well. I mentioned that in the previous video. And as I also mentioned, I decided to ask my parents if I could go somewhere else. I knew that they had set some money aside for this trip for Israel for me, so I basically argued that, I could always go to Israel later, but maybe I could use this money to go somewhere else. And by the way, I did end up going to Israel later in life twice, actually, where I did some filming in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, as well as in the West Bank, as part of a film project about international law, which brought me to many other countries, but maybe that's a story for another video. So back to when I was 16 years old and I had just made this humble request to my parents to go elsewhere. At this point, my parents were probably a little annoyed with me, and they also may just have thought that I was, wouldn't have enjoyed myself on the Israel trip, or maybe caused some trouble. I have no idea. But as I said before, my parents really were generally really supportive of me and my interests, and clearly I was expressing an interest that was born out of a real desire to do something different, to not just follow some predictable and padded path. My parents were awesome, and they always were. My mom still is, and I'm sure I would say the same about my father if he hadn't unfortunately passed away about 8 years ago now. So even if it made them a bit uncomfortable, they said, absolutely, you don't have to go to Israel this summer. So the question then became, well, where do I want to go? And honestly, I didn't really care. I just wanted it to be different. And remember, I was a 16-year-old kid getting an American-style public education and steady dose of nightly news and fairly useless Hebrew school rhetoric, meaning that I knew very little about the world beyond my neighborhood. So my mom was actually really good at this kind of research. She worked as a high school guidance counselor, and she was well equipped to find a bunch of options for me. And must have just been a few days later that she brought home a brochure from this thing called the Experiment in International Living. They ran these small group programs to different places all over the world for summer trip experiences. Part homestay, part community service, part education and learning, and of course a little fun too. The group sizes were like 10 to 15 students, and they were about 6 weeks or so each, and it honestly looked awesome. So I started leafing through the catalog and seeing countries and photographs of places, all over the globe. Of course, the brochure had the usual suspects like a summer in Paris or Lisbon or London, but there were plenty of more off the beaten path spots too, which is what I was really after. And so I remember circling 2 of their trips. One was to Thailand and the other one was to Ghana. And I brought this down to my parents not long after. And they looked it over, Ghana or Thailand, and my father saw that the Thailand trip flew out of Los Angeles and the Ghana trip flew out of JFK in New York. And while JFK was like a 2-hour drive away from our house and LA was on the other side of the country, and he wanted to drive me to the airport to see me off, and so Ghana it was. Now, I credit this trip with really sparking so many questions in my life, and really looking back on it now being probably the biggest fork in the road, which has led me to a life of documentary filmmaking and writing and philosophical inquiry. That's me, by the way, on the screen, scrawny and skinny with frosted tips, I know. listen, it was 1999. And if you're only listening to this on audio, you really are missing out. I won't go into the whole experience, of course, of the trip on this essay, but it really was rather incredible. I remember it being very well curated and well thought out, with kind of easing in, this little white boy from an affluent suburb into a different world without simply coddling and protecting me too much, or just plunging me in without any context. So we stayed in a university for a few days to learn some of the history and culture and a little language. And then we split off into different homestays for a few weeks in Kumasi, which was really fun. They were really wide ranging across the economic and social landscape. And then we all got together in a very small remote village to help construct a pavilion for an elementary school. This group, the experiment, still operates, by the way, and while I'm telling this story several decades later, I'm guessing it's still a pretty great company. So if you have a teen in your life and you have the means and can afford it, thumbs up from me. But anyway, over the summer in Ghana, I encountered a level of history and disparity and poverty and confusion that I don't think I've ever really understood. I had no idea where I fit into this entire picture. I had so many questions, and I felt so much bafflement. The world was just so much bigger and different than I had ever thought it was. And what I had learned or thought I knew about it was tiny, and was frankly doing a really poor job of explaining what I was seeing anyway. I remember coming back after this trip to my familiar suburb and just feeling so alien. As the family friends would come around, their sons or daughters all having participated in basically a cookie cutter experience in Israel, which barely required a unique retelling, they would eventually turn to me and ask, "Oh, how was it? How was Africa?" What a question. I had no idea what to say. It was just confusing. I mean, I could answer the questions about what kind of food I ate or what the weather was like or whatever, but anything of any real substance, I just had no idea. And I don't love that feeling. I like to understand. So I set out on a long journey to try to understand. And of course, that journey of seeking understanding is lifelong, and I would hope that it's lifelong on all subjects for everyone. And I'll just share one particular moment from that first trip that has always stayed with me as an example of this kind of mental paralysis. It was when I was in a small village. It was called Twifu Mampong. It's a few hours inland by car from Cape Coast, and I was up early that day. So it was when we were all helping dig for a school, but I was alone on this morning and decided to walk to the village by myself. And I had been in Ghana for a few weeks by this time, and all of the things were colliding in my head. I think I had gone into the trip as probably a bit of an idealistic kid, and I probably romanticized maybe non-Western cultures to a degree. Maybe I thought that they were kinder or more enlightened with their simplicity or something. Maybe I had this kind of contrarian idea that all of the material and so-called progress in my American life was really sort of soulless and stale. But out here in a place like Twifu Mampong, I would find, real meaning and spiritual connection or something like that. I think by this time, those kind of apologetics and condescension were already crumbling a bit for me. I had witnessed plenty of less than enlightened behavior around me, and I had been made aware of tribal and ethnic conflicts which I could barely comprehend and scarcely even recognize. I may have wanted to reject my American schooling, but I certainly didn't like witnessing the pretty harsh corporal punishment and whippings I would see from the teachers if a young child simply got a math problem wrong. But who was I to judge? Could I judge this? From what moral platform did I stand to criticize this other culture with its own histories and complexities? Did my ethnicity or skin color prevent such judgments? I was just stuck. And so, this one morning in the village, I was just kind of keeping my head down and walking as the sun was rising over the trees. If the human dynamics were confusing to me, at least the nature was uncontroversially beautiful. And this village was not very big. A visiting group of American teenagers for even a week was a cause for excitement and fervor. We had been welcomed in ceremonies and greeted by just about everyone at some point. So I knew several of the families, and I tried my best to piece together a few words of the Twi, that's the native language, to communicate. And as I was reaching a hill overlooking a small stream that ran alongside this tree line, I saw one of these people who I recognized. She was an old woman who I had been introduced to in one of these informal strolls through the village. And she was there in the stream, in the water, and she was washing clothes by hand. And I stopped and I looked at the scene. And at first glance, it could have been something out of a National Geographic special. You know, I would have flipped through on the television late at night through their channel. These are some postcards that I found, actually, which basically I could have snapped in that moment. These are from Zanzibar. I think this one's from Senegal. This one is Panama, of course, which is not in Africa, but kind of reflects the general homogenization and kind of flattening of non-Western worlds, which someone like Edward Said wrote so wonderfully about in Orientalism. And maybe the version of myself before I had gone on this trip might have admired and longed for the simplicity and closeness to nature or something like that in the scene that I was looking at. And perhaps there is something to be said for that, but as I looked at this scene of the woman in the stream, and having known this woman and what her life looked like, a thought was running through my head. This woman could really use a damn washing machine so she could get out of that malaria-plagued river and maybe even use that energy elsewhere. Was I allowed to think that thought? Did the truth of such a thought make me a capitalist or proponent of some kind of Western-style economic ideology that we must bring to this woman? What was I supposed to do with this thought that I felt like contained at least some truth? I had no idea. I probably just put my head back down and continued on my walk towards the site where I would have a definitive task with a shovel in my hand. Good. But the questions didn't stop. What the hell was going on with the world, and what should I even think about it, let alone do? So a few years later, I was a college student trying to figure out who I was and how to say anything. It's at university where my love of writing met my love of filmmaking, and I really began playing around in the medium of documentary. I was given a small grant by my school, actually, to go back to Ghana to produce a project. And it's not really fair to call it a documentary. It was more like an experiment in media creation and storytelling, a kind of meditation on visual narration and the limitations of film, really. I mean, the idea was pretty simple. I went to a very small village, actually not far from where I had seen this woman in the stream, and I had two small, simple Digital 8 handycams with me. And I gave one to a 10-year-old boy, and we basically filmed our lives and each other for about a month.
Okay, George. Have you seen this before? This is called a video camera. Can you say? You can point anything. Yeah, see? You can point it anywhere. And you see it?
The boy's name was George, and before you ask, the full film is not really available anywhere. It was really just sort of a school project, but I'll share more moments from it here to illustrate the points I want to make in this essay. We spent the month hanging out, basically. He would go off and film on his own sometimes, and he would bring me the tapes. Sometimes we would sort of stalk each other while we filmed different things and sort of observe. He got pretty good with the camera. And we both collectively filmed a lot of interesting things. And I mentioned that corporal punishment thing before in the schools because I also filmed things like this. this was a few years later from my first trip and seeing it the first time. And maybe my budding courage and my study of moral philosophy was helping me form a bit more of an opinion and, let's say, a judgment on such a practice. There's, of course, the practical arguments that from some standpoint, this kind of punishment doesn't really work very well if your goal is to instill a love of learning and teach young students important academic concepts. But there's also simply other moral attitudes towards that kind of practice, which I could recognize as true in myself, which would cast it as simply less moral or more cruel than a situation where that practice had been outlawed or never practiced at all in the first place. But still, the impulse to want to compare and contrast moral tribes and cultures is quite dangerous and uncomfortable. And so the necessary questions, I think, always have to be asked when we encounter things like this of why is this so? Why is this the case? How did it come to be this way? Which doesn't necessarily mean you can't form this moral judgment against them and hope to change them. But those questions can be asked about a lot of things that are not so morally comfortable in places like this, like corruption or attitudes and practices towards homosexuality or women's autonomy and freedom or treatment of mentally impaired people, or even just the alarming economic divisions. All things which an honest observer would recognize as less than morally ideal in a place like rural Ghana in the year 2001, which this was filmed in. So about those why questions, they're really hard to answer. But of course, history must play a prominent role in answering them. And Africa has plenty of complex history, which most Americans scarcely learn, including myself. So George lived just a few hours from the ocean, but he had never seen it. So one day we grabbed our cameras and jumped in a car and headed south straight for it. And this is what's on the coast. This is Elmina Castle. It was originally built in 1482 by the Portuguese for gold trading. But by the early 1500s, the castle transitioned into a key point in the slave trade as Portugal began trading slaves, mostly to their new possession in the Americas, which is known as Brazil today. The Dutch seized the castle in 1637 and continued the slave trade for almost 200 years before the British purchased it in 1872 and eventually outlawed and abolished the slave trade. Elmina is a common sight for visitors, and especially African Americans, many of whom can trace their lineage back through a particular door which led them to the waiting ships that would take them across the infamously treacherous and deadly Middle Passage. The narrow door is called the Gate of No Return, and it was the final piece of Africa that about 15 million humans would see on their way to the New World. George and I went to this gate after the small tour group had passed so we could share a moment or two in private. And I'll show you that in a minute. But first, we wandered through a small museum that was constructed on the grounds. George had two of his classmates here with him, and they huddled around the displays and practiced reading their English on the biographies of people like Muhammad Ali and Jackie Robinson and Martin Luther King, all names that I knew, of course. I was able to film them tracing their fingers along the slave routes, well worn here from all of the pilgrims who had traveled very far to do the same thing. They looked around in these sample slave auction blocks, and I tried to maintain my objective experiment and simply observe, but of course I was struck by the juxtaposition of this entire scene. And then George showed me this picture.
He was the first president?
Yes, and he collected Ghana.
He collected?
He was a monk, and have you seen the six? Have you seen the six people on the 20,000 money? The big six.
Yes, I have.
He was a monk. He was the first president, big six. And they used to say, Sister of Might.
So that's Kwame Nkrumah. I had heard his name on that first trip, but I really didn't know too much about him. Kwame Nkrumah is just not a name that is taught at all in Western schools. He was the first president and prime minister of an independent Ghana, leading the country to independence from Britain and its colonial rule in the year 1957. Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain its independence. And he was a champion of Pan-Africanism, which he advocated for the unity and liberation of Africa from colonialism. Became a key figure in the African independence movement. In my conversation with Vijay Prashad, we're going to talk a lot more about him, his story, and generally the story of the first few decades of newly formed independent nations in Africa in the 50s and 60s, like Congo, Algeria, Angola, Nigeria, and there's many, many others. I think it was really a crucial era to investigate if we hope to make sense of this growing sense of a teetering world order and a simmering anger and frustration, which the violent flashpoint of Palestine is proving to be a real rallying point of something that I feel is much bigger, or at least I hope will be. But at the time of this filming, I still didn't really know much about Kwame Nkrumah. I don't know if George really did either, but I could gather that Nkrumah had a complicated legacy in Ghana, even for a 10-year-old boy. So eventually, George and I were at that gate of no return, and we talked. And he was leaning on the gate, and his camera rolled on this symbolic point of view and this angle of the Ghanaian coastline, which at the time of the building of the castle was much closer to the coast, and the chain slaves would be boarded directly onto the ship. So as George and I shared this moment, we had this conversation, and he was singing this song.
6th of March, 1967, Ghana, Independence Day. 6th of March, 1967, Ghana, Independence Day. Here is coming. Like they can go anywhere they like. They can go anywhere they like and take any person they like.
Yeah.
They said a long time ago, like if you do bad, your mother will sell you for the slaves. So that you work. I've heard that my grandmother told me that if they let you go there, they won't give you enough food. But this now, everything has changed.
Yeah, everything.
Ghana has got their freedom. Like me, I'm here.
And that line from George struck me pretty hard. Like me, I am here. I ended up naming the project Like Me, I Am Here as an obvious way to point to this as an open question. You know, has everything changed? What has changed? And will it change? And George, like he said, he was still there while I was in America with a washing machine. Neither of us being asked to be born at all in the first place. And if you're curious about what some of that kind of thinking about the randomness of life and not choosing to be born and history sounds like in the head of a 10-year-old boy, well, this little exchange happened with George in a conversation we had while at his school.
One day, rapture my grandmother's mother's mother. He died in the castle.
Is it true? And if he had gone to America?
In the life, Papa. Like I was one day.
So if you didn't quite catch that, he was lamenting that his great-great-grandmother died in the slave castle because if she hadn't, then he would have been born in America. Obviously, the logic behind it is interesting, but the sentiment is difficult still to digest and contend with. I certainly couldn't deny that life for George might be easier and safer and healthier if he had been born in America rather than a small village in West Africa. But obviously, the perverse morality of the slave trade in that story is a real thing. And so, yes, this question of why things are the way they are, how did they come to be this way? Why is his life a struggle, and why does he get hit by teachers are all really difficult to answer. But it's definitely not enough to simply say that, oh, well, it's just their corrupt leaders, or the climate and diseases and geography, that's really what dictates our fate, or religious ideas are what holds them back, or the legacy of a slave trade is solely to blame, or colonialism, etc. And it's been my life's work to try to think about these things deeply and search for the right answers. And just as a preview of what Vijay and I will discuss, and to give a bit more of Kwame Nkrumah's story, Nkrumah wrote a book in 1965 entitled Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. Here's Nkrumah giving a bit of a speech to other African leaders with some of the ideas contained within it.
Africa is rich and not poor. It is Africans who are poor, not Africa. And they are poor because of the uncounted profit that has been made out of the exploitation of their labor and their lands. I raise this point so that it will stay in your minds when you may be tempted by the seductive promises of neocolonialism to forget the real character of colonialist imperialism and be persuaded away from your own true interests and those of Africa. For today, we must each see ourselves as part of Africa in order that we may face colonialist imperialism and its new form, neocolonialism, on a continent-wide front.
In the book, Nkrumah outlined his theory that African nations, although politically independent in name, were still economically dependent on and exploited by Western powers. In the book, he argued that former colonial powers and other global interests continued to exert control over African nations through economic means, undermining their true independence. Nkrumah's criticism of Western economic domination, particularly in relation to global financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, drew strong reactions from the West, as you can imagine, particularly from the United States and Britain, who were concerned about his socialist leanings and ties with the Soviet Union and China. And so in 1966, that's just a year after the book, a CIA-backed military coup ousted Nkrumah while he was on a state visit to North Vietnam and China. And this coup marked kind of the end of his presidency and his vision of a pan-African unity to resist neocolonialism. This famous photograph of him with his head in his hands upon learning of the coup tells 1,000 words. And Nkrumah, of course, was no perfect saint. In his efforts to maintain a united, non-aligned Pan-African bloc, which was being economically isolated and sabotaged by the West, he faced plenty of internal detractors and critics who he dealt with in, let's say, authoritarianism-ish ways. But there you go. There's no simple answers to these why questions. So I'll save more of that discussion about Nkrumah and that time period for Vijay to help with. But this brief touching on this idea of neocolonialism as a factor to consider of why George's life is the way it is and mine was the way it was when our worlds and cameras collided brings me nicely to the philosophical principle that I wanted to discuss in this essay, and a discussion on so-called wokeness and anti-wokeness, because you may have heard I sprinkled in a few little ideas in my thought process growing up and encountering these things, which might reflect some of the language today. So the principle I want to talk about is called Unjust Riches, and it goes like this. Imagine that you're a taxi driver, and one day you take your car in for a routine checkup, something simple like an oil change. And unbeknownst to you, another car with the same exact make and model as yours is brought in at the same time. And that other customer has prepaid for extensive repairs, new brakes, engine work, and other costly services. And due to a mix-up, the mechanic mistakenly starts working on your car instead of theirs. And later that day, the mechanic calls you up to let you know that your car's halfway finished and confirms that everything is covered. You quickly realize that there's been a mistake. The repairs they're describing are far beyond what you needed or expected, but you decide not to mention it. Instead, you approve the rest of the work, stay quiet, thinking you've just gotten a major upgrade for free, and then you go and pick up your car, which is now running smoother than ever, and you're enjoying the benefits as your taxi business starts to thrive. However, after a few weeks, the original customer returns to the mechanic only to discover that their car hasn't been touched, I guess, other than an oil change. The mechanic quickly realizes the mix-up and tracks you down. He demands compensation for the work done on your car. And when you refuse to pay, the mechanic takes you to court, arguing that you knowingly benefited from an error at their expense. The judge agrees, and even though you didn't cause the mistake, you knowingly took advantage of it. That's the injustice part of this. And thus you have to compensate the mechanic. Maybe he finds some kind of compromise, like half of the cost or something, since you had the knowledge to stop it at a certain point or something like that. Anyway, the point is that the issue has sort of been resolved. And while you may have initially profited from the situation, we get this kind of sense that justice has sort of figured itself out. Maybe not everyone is thrilled, but we can kind of move on with our lives, and justice has kind of reached a sort of equilibrium of sorts. And that's scenario one. And then in scenario two, it starts the same way. You bring in the car, so does the other guy who prepays for everything. The mix-up happens and you get that phone call about it. You also remain silent and let the repairs continue. You go in and get your fancy upgraded car, and the other guy shows up to find his car still broken. But in this scenario, for whatever reason, there's no recourse. There's no court to take him to or to take you to. No judges can intervene. And let's push it even further. Let's say the mechanic's shop was, really on the edge of bankruptcy, and this mix-up really screws him over. This injustice screws him over, and his workers quit when they're asked to work on another car for no more pay or something. So this other driver is really stuck with this broken car and out of cash. And then time passes in this sort of toy universe that I'm setting up. And the ripple effects of this one injustice grows. The other customer, unable to afford more repairs, faces financial difficulties, losing work opportunities, and falling behind. Over the years, your business thrives and your wealth grows, allowing you to invest in more cars and pass on success to your children. The other customer's family, however, struggles to recover from that initial setback, and decades later, maybe even centuries, one of their descendants stumbles upon the old records of the car repair mix-up and injustice, and he's investigating what's happening and realizing that, this small injustice from the past has shaped the fortunes of both families. And really, what can be done about it at that point? Could you even calculate some kind of financial compensation? I mean, how about all of the rides that people took in that unjust taxi company? It just becomes such a convoluted calculation that it quickly becomes comical. It seems like justice in this case really becomes very difficult, if not impossible to achieve. But that fact doesn't really do much to quell the resentment that might grow within this family. The social and economic divide between the families festers over time, and unresolved feelings of injustice might start to manifest in tensions, anger, maybe even conflict. The injustice that seemed small at first now looms large, and the opportunity for true justice has long since passed. And maybe in this admittedly exaggerated world that I've described, we would have some academic ideas developed, and the descendant of this taxi injustice comes up with phrases like intergenerational economic trauma or structural privilege accumulation. They begin to dissect how this one injustice led to their family's long-term economic struggles. Okay, so don't get too hung up on the details of the weird little taxi world that I just described. The point is to notice this funny thing about justice and windows of achieving it. Justice really is always playing a game of catch-up with the past. That's what justice is. It's an attempt to address historical wrongs, even if those historical wrongs are 5 seconds ago, which might explain why instant karma videos are so satisfying to people where, some jerk who is picking on someone or a cat like this video, gets what's coming to him naturally. And just to make this whole analogy clear that I'm laying out, and to tie it to my conflicting feelings with seeing the woman in a dirty river in Ghana, the historical injustices which have led to a wildly complex web of accumulated unjust riches would be like someone in that toy taxi universe from some side of that equation coming across some impoverished person who was a descendant of the injustice side and not even really being able to figure out exactly how the riches flowed to them. And George's 10-year-old logic of lamenting the fact that his ancestor died in the slave castle and, my understanding of that feeling he's having might be something like admitting to the fact that the randomness of existence might have been better for someone in the taxi universe to have happened to be born on a certain side of the branching universe of that injustice. Again, obviously, I'm being trite here with analogizing something like historical racial slavery and imperialism with, a taxi mishap. But that's kind of the point, to try to find these principles, to examine them. I mean, how do I benefit from the unjust riches of slavery? Does my skin color allow me access to those benefits in such a way that some random person enjoying a smooth taxi ride in the unjust taxi universe would have? Yeah, something like that. I mean, I've visited as a tourist the beautiful cities of Amsterdam and Lisbon, and I've enjoyed them very much, engaging in the exchange of my wealth with their economies and infrastructures which are built upon that legacy. Anyway, I think you get the point. But really, what I want to focus on is how the principle of unjust riches shows how there is a window that really does seem to close at some point where a real sense of justice is no longer achievable, which again does not erase the hurt feelings and resentment and anger. Those things, of course, long outlive the window's closing. And importantly for this discussion on wokeness, those things can become a bit too attractive as explanatory reasons for current failures or imbalances. I think that would probably be true in the taxi story, of course, but it's also entirely possible for it to be true in much more real, national, or ethnic historical injustices. So pitting all of the world's ills, or all of West Africa's ills, including, why kids might be getting hit in schools today, completely on the injustice, the historical injustice of slavery or even colonialism, is not entirely honest either. Or in the case of Palestine, you hear some of the voices of Palestinians, and I've talked to some who kind of give the, history is unfair, just get over it. Zionism's bullying behavior in 1948, doesn't explain all of the problems or explain why certain religiously framed movements have regressive attitudes towards women's rights, for example. And sure, that, I think, is a habit of the so-called woke that should be tended to a little more carefully and appropriately. But I think, to give the woke full credit, they are a group of people who are rightfully being, let's call it, radicalized or activated and galvanized by historical injustices, which do hold plenty of explanatory power over current situations. If you want to answer the question of why the Congo is so poor, and you point to the centuries of exploitation, plunder, divide and conquer strategy, and depopulation crafted by European powers to fuel their growth and progress, I don't think anybody would deny it as a monumental factor. The problem is simply asking the question, is that window to achieve the sense of justice still open? And that's when the answers get really difficult. And the woke, nor the anti-woke, can really adequately answer it. You know, we've seen the sloppy efforts of young woke students, maybe during Black Lives Matter movements or Me Too movements, if they try to achieve some kind of societal justice equilibrium by tactics like forcing people to say certain things or check privileges or cancel culture or agree to certain, not so well thought out demands. And yeah, the psychology of vengeance when seeking justice is a very fine line to be aware of that I'll mention. So I think, again, the so-called woke are rightfully animated by horrors of the past, which were never adequately addressed, and at least partially explain inequalities of the present. But they can fail to recognize the futility of chasing down these justice solutions long after the window has closed. And the so-called anti-woke have a tendency to dismiss, diminish, or ignore the gravity of the original injustice, or resent the woke for manifesting their efforts to achieve impossible justice through unfair and maybe vengeful tactics. But, and here is the big but, not all windows to justice are closed. I mean, do I think a sense of justice can really be achieved for the moral crime of the institution of slavery? No, not really. And not just because the crime was so big and brutal. I mean, were reparations paid by the Dutch to Ghana? If they did that, would that do the trick? I mean, we could debate that. Just a few years ago, actually, in the year 2021, Amsterdam's mayor, Femke Hallemse, apologized for the city's historical role in the slave trade. And in December 2022, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte offered a formal apology on behalf of the Dutch state for its historical role in slavery. And of course, Hallemse and Rutte never personally participated in the slave trade, and their apologies were only ever heard by people who were never enslaved directly. This, in my taxi analogy, was the funny scenario too, where maybe centuries later, people are apologizing for this auto theft. And so fine, take them for what they're worth, these apologies, which I guess is something, but I doubt many people hearing them feel that a sense of true justice has been restored. And I could fill the rest of this essay with parallel stories of acknowledgments and apologies centuries too late, which I don't criticize or disagree with. I think they're just fine. But what I want to shift the conversation to is how so much of that frustration of not being able to really achieve this justice, because it is unachievable, tends to funnel towards the open windows where we do feel like we can still address it. And that, I would argue, is a huge reason why the world is so focused and energized on Palestine. And I won't review the history here, but I'll just say that it is not some woke fantasy that the Palestinians suffered a massive injustice at the hands of colonial powers and Zionism. And note, for all my haters out there, that I put that injustice not solely on Zionists or Jews, but largely at the feet of the colonial powers like Britain, of course, and subsequently the neocolonial power of the United States. And so there's a feeling of urgency with this because it is not ancient history. And the window to achieve justice is, yes, closing, and certainly Israel has been doing everything in their power to grab the top of that windowsill and slam it shut by, as they say, changing the facts on the ground with settlements and gestures at terrorism and everything else. And so the Palestinian cause becomes, for some people, a kind of stand-in symbolic fight for justice, where other fights were lost because of the natural process of time passing and those windows closing. We can recognize the Palestinian window is open and we rush towards it. I call, by the way, the process of letting that window close naturally and kind of intentionally stalling on time and changing the facts on the ground as a kind of moral responsibility laundering. It's an analogy to money laundering, where you hide the paper trail of an economic crime through a series of sales and resales on the open market in such a way that it becomes impossible to untangle the knot and figure out how to restore a sense of justice and return things to some even and fair state. So now I want to weave in the idea of free will. Actually, I think a comment on one of these videos suggested that I read some Robert Sapolsky, and I'm familiar with his work, and I appreciate the comment, and so this is a bit of a response to that. I think it's actually a really important discussion when it comes to this fuzzy idea of justice that I've been talking about, as opposed to the idea of peace. So I'm going to try to use this to distinguish those a bit. So here's what I mean. Philosophy debates, by the way, over the idea of free will are pretty exhaustive, so I won't rehash the entire field, but I'll lay out the basic argument of a determinist anti-free will position. So this is a classic example, but it works great, so I'm going to use it. Charles Whitman, known as the Clock Tower Shooter, was a former Marine who, in 1966, went on a tragic killing spree from a tower at the University of Texas, killing 14 people and injuring many others. Before the rampage, Whitman had been suffering from excruciating headaches and severe mental distress. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, he visited doctors, but nothing seemed to explain his escalating aggression and confusion. The night before the attack, he even killed his wife and mother, leaving behind a note that begged for an autopsy to be performed on his brain. In the note, Whitman expressed that he didn't understand his own violent urges and hoped the autopsy would reveal the reason for his uncontrollable behavior. After Whitman was shot and killed by police, an autopsy was performed, and doctors discovered a large tumor pressing against a part of his brain known to be involved in emotional regulation and impulse control. And while it's impossible to say for certain how much the tumor contributed to his actions, its presence forced a shift in how we might assign moral responsibility. Suddenly, his story isn't just about an evil individual making conscious decisions and choices. It becomes more complex, involving this physical cause that influenced his actions, that he didn't choose to grow, obviously. If Whitman's brain had been damaged by the tumor, was he fully responsible for what it made him do? And many people, upon learning of the tumor, began to reconsider their judgment of his actions, realizing that something beyond his control may have contributed to the violence or fully caused it. Now imagine if Whitman hadn't been killed that day, if police had captured him alive. It would seem irrational and morally wrong to deny him surgery to remove the tumor as punishment for his crimes. We would clearly see that removing the tumor wouldn't be about excusing his actions, but addressing the underlying physical cause. It wouldn't make sense to say, he deserves to keep the tumor as part of his punishment, because the tumor is what likely pushed him towards those actions in the first place. It wouldn't be about free will, it would be about treating the condition that shaped his behavior. And what would be even more irrational might be to perform the surgery to remove his tumor and then keep him in prison to punish him for the things he did while he had the tumor. Again, presuming we could, with great confidence, conclude that the tumor really was the primary and nearly complete cause of his actions. So here's where the argument against free will deepens. The tumor in that story is just one specific example of a particular physical system causing particular behaviors. But if we accept that Whitman's tumor played a role in his actions, we must also consider that all of our behaviors, whether we have tumors or not, are caused by the states of our brains and the environment, which are shaped by physical factors like genetics, of course the environment, experiences, none of which we choose. So, just as Whitman's actions were determined by his brain's state and the environment, so are ours. So there's no point in the unfolding chain of events where we can pause the universe and insert some kind of magical free will. Our choices are shaped by the physical systems of our bodies and the world around us. just like it wouldn't make any sense to punish Whitman for his tumor-induced behavior, it raises the question of whether any of us are truly free in the way that we often think we are. The entire argument against the existence of free will can sort of be summed up like this. We certainly didn't choose our environment or our genetics, and if you insist that there's some kind of metaphysical soul which stands apart from all of that stuff, but can sort of respond and react to it, well, great. We don't choose that either. So, for example, let's forget Whitman and his tumor and just think of Jeffrey Dahmer, a person who killed and ate his victims. If I exchanged my atoms and quarks and whatever else constitutes my physical system with Dahmer, then I would be Dahmer. And I would do exactly what he did, right? But again, if part of you resists that thought by saying, no, I would still retain my soul, and I'm not a serial killer, so I would be in Dahmer's body, sure, but I wouldn't do what he did. Well, fine. If that's true, then great. Then I'm very lucky for having the soul that I have, and Dahmer apparently wasn't blessed with such a lucky soul. Anyway, if this is your first time encountering this argument, it's a very old and fun one in philosophy, and there's a lot more to say about it, and really endless arguments about what's called libertarian free will and compatibilism and all kinds of things. I really enjoy those discussions, but I won't have one with myself here, because I think that argument that I just laid out is basically inescapable, although there are certainly philosophers who make too much of it. But the interesting way that it interacts with this conversation about peace and justice is what I want to talk about, because the real hardcore anti-free willers out there really do kind of erase moral responsibility, at least in some very deep and cosmic way. And moral responsibility is fairly crucial to this sense of justice that I've been discussing. For example, the families of the people who Whitman killed might really feel very hopeless in a search for justice upon learning of the tumor. Perhaps they could turn it towards ire towards the doctors who failed to recognize the tumor, or the system or the politics which allowed him to access the gun. But remember, the doctor and everyone else in those stories also lacks this genuine free will in the determinist view of the universe. Noticing the illusory nature of libertarian free will can be morally destabilizing for some. And if that's you, let me attempt to stabilize you by showing you how deterministic truths lay the groundwork for compassion, actually. So imagine a magical device, like a ray gun that would cure a person of all of their harmful thoughts, ideas, and urges. Let's set aside the complicated question of what a cure is and how we would decide on what thoughts and behaviors need fixing, just for a moment. Instead, let's focus on something nearly everyone agrees on is universally harmful, like murder. So imagine you had this cure gun in your left hand, and in your right hand you had an old-fashioned steel and bullets kill gun. And you come across someone who's about to commit murder. Someone standing over their victim, ready to end their life. In that moment, if you have these two devices, it becomes incredibly difficult to justify using the kill gun instead of the cure gun. If you could instantly stop the person and cure them of their violent urges, let's say turning someone with murderous intent into a meditating monk or something, how could you ever justify using the kill gun? You wouldn't just save the victim's life, you'd transform the would-be murderer into someone capable of joy and contributing positively to the world. This magical cure gun, I'm imagining, might be considered like a kind of instant aggressive tumor surgery ray. It would target the brain and rearrange it in such a way as it would no longer be producing these murderous and aggressive impulses. Well, bad news. Cure guns don't exist. But of course, there are many forms of intervention, rehabilitation, even pharmaceutical treatments that are weaker versions of this kind of idea. If you could stop the murderer without killing them and then bring them to a rehabilitation facility. This would basically be a cure gun. And so recognizing that, what's called libertarian free will doesn't truly exist might seem unsettling at first, but I think you can see how it can start to open the doors towards greater compassion. So this understanding of anti-free willism creates a moral imperative to focus on compassionate interventions instead of punitive responses. In fact, punishment for its own sake ceases to make much sense. And each day that we don't figure out how to build a real cure gun or its equivalent is, in a sense, a real philosophical tragedy. But of course, if you don't have a cure gun in your hand, or you don't even know what it even means to build one, then you get into these situations where one ends up regrettably being forced into using the kill gun in some sort of utilitarian analysis. But let's pretend we have these kinds of cure guns and these really effective non-lethal interventions focused on turning aggressive violence into something else. So, and you may have already noticed this, the idea of justice kind of slips through the cracks in that whole way of thinking. For example, I'm not sure what that person who was about to be murdered in my scenario would think about me simply transforming her would-be murderer into some kind of peaceful, smiling gentleman who she might see shopping in her neighborhood and going about his daily life the very next week or for the rest of her life. Of course, from some kind of rational perspective, it shouldn't really matter to her, I guess. I mean, he's no longer a threat in that world to anyone. In many real ways, he's not even the same person who he was when he was about to harm her, even though he looks the same. But I have to admit and agree that something does feel very unsatisfying about that picture. So now let's push the thought even further and also lose the cure gun from the hypothetical, the same way that we lost Whitman's tumor. Let's imagine that someone has done some really awful things, like murder or worse, and they've never gone to jail or anything like that, but then they really just have a big change of heart. Maybe they read something that changes their mind, or they go to therapy, or they just have a kind of inner moral awakening or whatever. And they say, you know what, I was really wrong for doing all that, and I'm never going to do anything like it ever again. I don't know what came over me. Okay, so of course you'd be a little more skeptical of this declaration, but let's say that you had some kind of way of really verifying it. I don't know, with extensive testing or brain scanning or putting them through realistic simulations or whatever. It was really just as true and reliable and solid as the cure gun thing that you were imagining. They absolutely posed no threat any longer. What would or should we do then? Should we still throw them in jail? Wouldn't that be exactly like putting Whitman in jail as punishment after he had surgery to remove the tumor which caused the behavior in the first place? Should we just make them express how sorry they are for all of that stuff before and then move on? Should we have them cry and apologize endlessly to the victims' families? Should the victims be allowed just one more swift kick to the shin or something like that? Suddenly, with these kinds of questions, you can see that our concern has shifted from preventing future harms done by this person, and the moral logic of punishment for its own sake has kind of fallen apart when we see the illusory nature of free will. So we're left thinking mostly about the feelings, concerns, and dignity of the victims. And that's really the point that I want to make here when it comes to peace versus justice. I think justice really is a kind of feeling. It's a psychological state, and it's a sense. And peace, in a very simple definition, really is a kind of fact about violence. And this is where you get those oh-so-exhausting facts don't care about your feelings mantras from very shallow pundits, some of whom share my last name. And the focus on that kind of peace and security that they tend to promote is one that is just completely blind to ideas of justice and fairness. And so, to end this essay and share with you where my thinking is taking me these days, I spend a lot of time thinking about what justice really means and just how important it is to us as humans. And I also, of course, think about peace as well, which I hope I've explained is actually a different but obviously entangled concept with justice. And really, I think it's a mistake to completely favor one over the other entirely. They just don't work that way. Peace without justice is an illusion and ticking time bomb where the festering residue of unjust enrichment will poison the well and potentially, unnecessarily, burn the whole thing down. And justice without peace can easily morph into vengeance and aggressive forms of domination and authoritarian bullying. Justice and peace exist in a kind of tenuous balance at all times, and really that is what political and moral philosophy is all about. So I think many of us are feeling that Palestine and what I think is the violent implosion of the Zionist project is really an earthquake under our feet. And the tremors of that earthquake are shaking the entire global structure. And in particular, the very insular and isolated American empire. I think many of us are asking long overdue questions as to why the world is the way it is. I think the skepticism aimed at the rhetoric of the so-called Western values when it comes to protecting and promoting democracy and fighting authoritarianism has settled into just full-blown hypocrisy when we honestly consider the alliances and relationships which we're told by the media to support. And once all that rhetoric falls apart, we're really left with a lot of questions. And people are starting to ask them about Ukraine and Israel, and I hope many, many other places as well. Like, who was Kwame Nkrumah? And why did I have a washing machine and not George? And what happened in Congo when they achieved their independence? And what about South Yemen or Oman when they were leading a feminist collectivist revolution in an area of the world with some of the most important shipping lanes and oil reserves to the energy-hungry European powers? And while formal colonialism and slavery have ended, and as I've argued, may have had their windows of justice closed as well, have they morphed into a new form of continued injustice, which is being broadcast as a clash of ideas and cultures that ends up victim blaming those who are still suffering in this form of neocolonialism? Because I think everyone can agree that peace is certainly under threat in the world. But if we don't honestly seek answers to the kind of questions that I'm raising, and we cling to some false good versus evil clash of civilizations fairy tale told by unserious Western media mouthpieces, then we have no hope of understanding or adequately addressing or satisfying the sense of justice which is being sought by so many who can't enjoy or participate in the peace even if they are invited into it, because of that philosophical entanglement which I laid out. If you're offered peace and even some kind of prosperity by historical and modern so-called benevolent superpowers without ever attaining a real sense of justice and dignity, it really can feel hollow and tainted. And peace is precious. Let's not forget that. But it's also kind of cheap. You can't bribe people with peace if justice is not addressed. But I think and hope that forgiveness is more possible than people realize. It takes an ounce of courage, but everyone who has ever even been in an interpersonal relationship and gotten into an argument and felt the anger and sort of ugly thoughts race through our veins, we know that mustering the words, "I'm sorry," can be a monumental task. And actually meaning it is even harder sometimes. And then, of course, adjusting one's behavior to match that meaning might be harder still. And perhaps hardest of all is accepting an apology and acknowledgement of harm without weaponizing it and keeping score. Clearly, I think those interpersonal dynamics scale up to sociological understandings of countries and tribes stuck in these cycles of violence. I do think acknowledgement of historical harm while the Unjust Riches windows are still open is a vastly underrated step in all processes of peace and justice. In Palestine, and now Lebanon, we keep hearing this word ceasefire. Ceasefire, fine, whatever. Clearly, the Democrats in America are using this as some kind of election trigger if they think they can get this or whatever. And I know that they've changed the meaning of ceasefire to make these like 21-day or 6-week proposals completely ridiculous redefinitions of what ceasefire is supposed to mean. But we don't need a ceasefire or the kind of ceasefire they're talking about. We need an actual peace process. And to be more accurate, using my philosophical language, we need a solution which restores a sense of justice, which will then inevitably lead to peace. Peace is an emergent property of the underlying interactions of justice. You cannot produce peace without generating justice, just like you can't produce an ocean wave without generating the behaviors and interactions of water molecules at a much smaller scale. Back when I was more actively involved in the daily debates on social media and this kind of stuff, I used to constantly remind people that bad psychology beats good philosophy every day of the week. And I guess this is another good example of it. If a sense of justice is a psychological state and a psychological pursuit, and peace is a sort of philosophical fact about levels of physical harm, then you better be paying attention to the right piece of that equation. And that window of achieving historical justice for the Palestinian cause is still open. Barely, but it is. And as I try to broaden my conversation to what I hope will be a global justice movement, it's going to be a constant effort to deeply understand how we got here historically from a global perspective. And so I hope you enjoy the following conversations with VJ, Juan, and Irene, and whoever else I can tap, because I'm still filled with the same damn questions that I started asking at 16 years old. And just to finish this off, I'll share one last piece of video that George and I filmed right after we left the Gate of No Return, when he found an injured bird struggling in one of the slave dungeons whose walls have witnessed unimaginable horror and countless people who themselves never saw justice. But we here in our time can only contend with the problems that we encounter and notice the open windows of justice, no matter how small.
Should we let him be there? We want him to fly away.
Okay.
Oh, you get a pen.
Yeah. I think its wing has been hurt.
Come back.